Hello, I'm Todd Dean, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Dialogues on Canadian Energy with Dennis McConaghy. Dennis, welcome.
Thank you, Todd. Nice to be with you.
So, Dennis, let's lay out a little bit of your biography first. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I was an energy executive for over 35 years in Alberta, and had a fairly typical Alberta experience of graduating from an engineering school in the mid-'70s, moving on to the private sector in the early 80s, around when the National Energy Program unfolded in Alberta, and notwithstanding that, carved out a career almost exclusively in the sort of commercial business development area. And over the last 15 years, I was very fortunate to be part of most of the major pipeline developments that were pursued to move Alberta's hydrocarbons to market. And those were both with respect to gas and with respect to oil. And of course, as all that was unfolding, there was the phenomena of climate change and how that was going to affect this industry. And as my career unfolded, I became more enmeshed in dealing with those issues as they constrained what we were trying to do commercially. So I had a perspective that evolved out of that business career that even after I had retired, there were so many things about the experience of trying to do these projects as they became so much more difficult to do, that I wanted to make sure that there was more public discussion of some of the issues at hand here. And of course, as most Albertans did, you kind of are here and enjoyed a significant prosperity over that 35 years, raised a family. And for much of that time, potential future success all seemed relatively attainable. Today's circumstances seem so much more edgy, so much more tenuous, because some of the fundamental precepts we used to believe in may not apply anymore. And that's mostly because we're developing a resource that a lot of people have fundamental issues with. And of course, that was all played out in respect to Keystone XL. So hopefully that gives you some sense of where I'm coming from.
So, Dennis, what do you see as the, vision or purpose of this podcast going forward?
I really have this hope for this podcast, that it becomes a place where significant discussion can occur about the real significant issues that are going to impact whether or not this country, and especially this province, can continue to develop its hydrocarbon resources in a way that is somewhat reasonably aligned to the world's expectation about what would represent credible carbon policy. And that's an enormous challenge. And these issues are going to define not just Alberta's prosperity, but I still believe a substantial amount of Canada's prosperity. And there are, in my judgment, an inadequate number of forums where people in a much more responsive way can come and have some discussion that frankly looks at the trade-offs between what may be economically at stake versus the ambitions to progress carbon containment, carbon adaptation, all of that agenda versus how much may be at stake economically for this country. It's my sense that that's been discussed, underappreciated by our political process, and even the way these issues have been discussed by academics and Canadian think tanks. It's been my sense that there just hasn't been enough platforms like, hopefully I hope this one becomes, where this discussion can take place so people can actually have a more nuanced opinion about the trade-offs that are at hand. And in fact, there are some very huge decisions that are shortly at hand. So if in summary, this is a place to improve the quality of the dialogue about these trade-offs between our hydrocarbon potential and our quest to be credible about carbon.
So where do you see the format of this podcast and sort of the frequency? What can people expect going forward?
Well, this is going to evolve over time. I hope to probably do about 2 per month. I don't want it just to be my pontifications. I hope to be able to have others who I believe have both interesting opinions, are engaging people to talk to, and have some real background on some of these issues at hand, that we can have an exciting discussion, an informative discussion, and do this on a sufficient frequency that it is topical and is engaging to people as they interact to these events, in all kinds of ways. And of course, for many people, especially here in Alberta, how some of these decisions play out affect them very personally, which we can understand from what's happened over the last 2 years across the economy of Alberta, as the price of oil, other costs have gone up. There's been a contraction. That's all manifested itself in a kind of urgency to see whether or not some of the policies that have been undertaken have any payoff or not. But we'll be evolving this, but for the time being, I hope to have others join me on this and we'll try to do it on a bi-weekly basis. If there's some reasons to do it more frequently, we can always adapt to that, but that would be my initial intention.
So then, outline some of the major issues that you may be dealing with over the remainder of the year and maybe into next year.
Sure. And I'll try to express them perhaps bluntly and maybe too simplistically, but I think perhaps they'll make the point. A real question, I think, that is facing this country is whether or not you can actually build a major hydrocarbon pipeline in this country anymore. And so one of the topics that we'll be examining as this year plays out is whether or not the 2 or 3 remaining major hydrocarbon projects can actually be approved by the Trudeau government later this year. Most prominent in that would be the project related to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is a pipeline that moves ever since the early 50s, oil from Edmonton to the Lower Mainline. That's there's a project that would expand that pipeline, and it's kind of like a default relative to not having access to Keystone XL. That project, has become even more significant when you couple it with the fact that the Enbridge Northern Gateway project was not approved. So the fate of that pipeline is going to be a major statement about how all these issues unfold. Another one to watch, and we'll be talking about, is whether or not the Trudeau government approves the project at Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which is an LNG project sponsored by the Malaysian multinational Petronas, which would take Canadian gas, most of it from northwest Alberta and northeast BC, move it through pipelines across British Columbia and turn it into liquefied natural gas and export it to Asia to, for the most part, displace coal in Asia as a source of electrical generation. That project also has to be approved later this fall, and will be another major statement of how the Trudeau government is handling that. Those are going to be 2 seminal moments. But beyond that is going to be how Canada deals with the commitments it's made at Paris, how in dealing with those commitments, how much it relies on policy instruments like carbon pricing versus regulation, how much it's going to impose certain demands of one province versus another, and how all that plays out is going to be of enormous import, certainly to the province of Alberta, and I submit to the rest of the country. So that is overlays the fate of these 2 pipelines, but I would submit the fate of those 2 pipelines, say, a lot about how the federal government's coming to terms with all this. Beyond that, we're going to see what happens over time in the United States. If Mrs. Clinton is elected president, how will she actually progress carbon policy more aggressively? And will she rely more on regulation versus pricing? And then we'll also talk about, how the Notley government here in Alberta tries to find a rationalization of its carbon tax policy if it gets no quid pro quo from the rest of the country. Because Albertans will be paying a tax, which we'll talk about more in the future, but it is a significant tax, and what are they getting for it? And that's one of the great questions, and we'll elaborate that. So in short, over the next 6 months, I think these are the major topics that we're going to be engaged in, because they are actually defining of how this country can either get its act together or not.
So then, all these issues, of course, are at play, and you've got, people tend to have an opinion on energy and pipelines,
Yes.
a lot of times without really knowing a lot of the detailed information. So why do you think Canadians, and especially Albertans, should care about the issues and opportunities that this podcast is going to be dealing with?
Well, I think one point that is more intuitively appreciated within Alberta is that without a vibrant hydrocarbon industry, this province doesn't work. I mean, work in the sense that its basic fiscal premises get very strained. The same is true at the federal level. Like, the rest of the country has always, to my opinion, underappreciated how much of the contribution to the national GDP actually comes from the production and export of hydrocarbons. So fundamentally, if you decide as a country we're not doing hydrocarbons because we just can't believe that they are rationalizable to a low carbon world, it begs the question of, well, what are we going to replace the economic contribution that they used to represent? That should be of great concern to all Canadians. With Albertans, it's uniquely urgent because, to be very blunt about it, unless there's a way of finding a middle ground, a common ground between increasing production and being credible on carbon, over time, Albertans would be expected to constrain this industry, constrain its potential. And, that is a vision of Alberta very much different than so many in my generation ever imagined would be the case. So, I would just make this point. The NDP, the role of the Alberta government traditionally has been to fight for Alberta interests. In the case of the new Notley government, it acted on the belief that being credible on carbon would create some kind of quid pro quo on market access. That has yet to happen. So these things are very urgent, but every Albertan, just speaking about Albertans, have faced increased taxes, will face more next year when they're actually going to pay a carbon tax in addition to the higher income taxes. A lot of that is driven because the commodity price is lower, but by the same token, when you think about the loss of XL and the volumes that we could have been exporting and could have been exporting at a higher margin, which were lost to us, and how difficult it has been to replace that project, I mean, that's a lot of value that has left this province. So these issues should really be front and center as defining, what is it that the government's approach to trying to find a way to realize economic potential and stay credible on carbon is like really job one, because everything else that Albertans expect from their government is, fundamentally derived by being affluent, rich enough to afford the kinds of services that we not only count on, but believe are almost like a right to have. Well, unless something is solved here, if you're going to sustain those services, you're either going to have to tax people more or borrow more until at some point that doesn't become sustainable. All of which would tell me that these are issues that can't be discussed enough in terms of like, how does this government get these decisions right? I'm always believing that, Albertans get that intuitively. The rest of the country at times, I think, wants to believe that Canada is more than just its hydrocarbon potential, despite, the brave words of Stephen Harper of many years ago, Canada is an energy superpower. Well, in a $100 a barrel crude world, in a world of very low commitments to climate change, that was undoubtedly true. So it's more complicated today. So I think, if nothing else, how Canadians and Albertans actually improve their economy should make them absolutely engaged in these issues. So that's why I believe it's intensely relevant to, or should be seen as intensely relevant to Canadians.
So, Dennis, what can we look forward to in the next session?
Well, I think in the next session, one thing that we should probably focus on would be to specifically talk about these 2 or 3 pipelines a little bit more specifically, especially the Kinder approval, the Petronas approval, the treatment in the past of where Northern Gateway would stand, and then, of course, the pipeline known as Energy East, all of which were really, at least the 3 oil ones, were projects that were, in one respect or another, alternatives to Keystone XL. And so we'll talk about crude oil pipelines in our next session for the most part. Probably after that, we'll talk specifically about the issues related to the Prince Rupert LNG project and where that stands, because there are real differences between the two. But probably and fixing the details of those 3 pipeline projects where they stand today, we'll do that. And then over time, we'll try to relate that to giving people a sense of why an approval may be so difficult for this current federal government to rationalize, because these pipes, almost undoubtedly, if they are actually built and constructed, will lead to more oil production, which will lead to more carbon emissions, which will put Canada further away from some of the commitments it made at Paris. That would be where the balance of probabilities would be. So how do you actually rationalize that? Well, that's something we'll talk more about, because that's actually what is churning amongst those who have to actually make this decision at the federal level. Like, how do I come to terms with a growing hydrocarbon sector and a commitment to reduce carbon emissions? Since in the short and medium run, if you make more oil sands barrels, you're going to have more carbon emissions. And the only way you can maybe rationalize that is through carbon pricing. So we'll talk about carbon pricing probably in the next second or third session up here to have some discussion on that.
Dennis, thanks for this, and I look forward to the next session.
Yes, thank you very much.